And welcome to this episode of Trust or Bust, where we are talking about the things that salespeople do that can break that all important element of selling. And we're looking at different parts of sales. And so in this episode, we're going to talk about closing. There's a lot talked about closing, there's a lot written about closing. So we better define exactly what we're talking about. So, Moed, how are we defining closing for the purpose of this discussion?
Yeah, a good starting point. So closing is not the aggressive closing tactics of winning the sale or getting agreement or getting the contract or producing your ready-made contract and slapping it on the table and getting someone to sign it, all of which people tend to only do at the end of the sales discussion. Um, Closing in for our definition and for best practice purposes is about gaining commitment. And gaining commitment does not need to happen at the very end. In fact, it should not be the only case that
Okay, so we're not back in time going all 80s on everyone. I'm going to teach them loads of ABC tactics and Glengarry Glen Ross coffee for closers and all that sort of business then.
Most certainly not. We're not living in the 80s.
It's not what we're about. Okay, so I mean, by saying that, I'm being a bit facetious, but that I'm guessing that's the kind of thing that salespeople are doing, or if they've got that mentality, where they're going to break trust, where they're going to go wrong. Is that right?
Yeah, so one of the important things of gaining someone's trust is to gain that person's commitment, which is our definition of closing, right? And gaining someone's commitment requires you to have them come with you along the journey. So if you're just talking at someone and not inviting their commitment, not inviting them to share something, which is another form of gaining commitment, then you haven't really brought them along the journey. And then all of a sudden you're slapping them with a request for a commitment and a big commitment right at the end. And there's a lot of research around, getting people to do small things for you along the way will help make it easier for them to then agree to the bigger things.
Okay, so let's hang on to that. So I want to come back to that doing the small things along the way, because when you talk about the journey, it is quite a journey now, isn't it? There's lots of potential stages, lots of potential things where we're just going to get that little piece of commitment to move forward, to advance.
Yeah.
I'm thinking move to the next
Yeah.
meeting, introduce to other people, do a demo. What other things would you say we might be doing?
Yes. It's all those things and more, right? So gaining commitment happens at every stage of the sales or buyer's process. And what we need to do is understand what are the commitments that we want them to adhere to and to commit to doing. So two broad sweeping examples would be number one, gaining the buyer's commitment to move from, say, first meeting to a demo or a second meeting, whatever it is, however it is you want to define. So gaining that person's commitment. And this is not about forcing them to do it. This is you've done the right things. And during the meeting, which is what the best salespeople do, they ask the buyer, let's bring up our diaries together. Let's agree on a time right now. That is gaining commitment. Not, okay, we agreed to talk about this. Let me come back to you on some dates and times, which is what the buyer would normally say. That is not gaining commitment. Gaining commitment is a firm, fixed, agreed action step that is going to happen or most likely going to happen. The second example for gaining a commitment will be, usually if done right, both of you will have tasks, right? At the end of a meeting, agreed next steps. You as a salesperson, them as the buyer, right? So gaining commitment to ensuring that they are going to do their part, because you as the seller are surely, hopefully going to do your part, gaining that commitment, some form of accountability that they will do it and that they will come prepared or will take those steps, that's another form of gaining commitment. But it happens all throughout the sales process.
All the way, yeah. It's what we can sometimes get caught, can't we, in a continuation where we think things are moving forward because you liked it, you've agreed that you like it, but nothing's actually logged as going to happen next. And that's the difference between the commitment, so a continuation, and an advancement. We're looking for advancements, yeah. So
Yes,
you
we're
said
looking
something
for
really
advancements.
interesting.
And no, go ahead.
No, it's just something really interesting then about we're looking for advancements and that we invite them to do something. And you're going to tell us about some psychology and how using small increments, small things is a good way to do this.
Yeah, there's a bunch of research out there that have shown this, and certainly books such as, Robert Cialdini's, which is 50 Ways to Get to Yes, and The Influential Mind by Tali Sharot, all very well-known books. But it's quite well known. To get someone to take a big commitment, don't ask them for the big commitment first. Ask them to make small commitments, right? And numerous small commitments before doing so. So why is that important? From the buyer's perspective, it makes them feel comfortable because smaller commitments should hopefully mean smaller effort and therefore lower risk. And as they take, and those smaller commitments should be incremental along the journey towards the big commitment. Even better, if those smaller commitments formulate a part of that bigger commitment. So every time they take those smaller commitments, you're shaving away the size of the bigger commitment that you will ask later on. So that's a really, really valuable thing to do. Think about when you buy something, right? When you're buying something that's quite big or you're making a big decision on something, you break it up into small, little decisions, right? So you say, well, if I'm going to buy this house, for example, well, first thing I want to look at is, okay, I need to check my credit rating. Small commitment, right? Let me check that I even have the credit rating to be able to borrow the money. I need to. There are a whole host of steps before actually just going to buy the house. You don't just jump straight into it and then have the meetings and then try to sort out the mortgage, right? A smart person will look at all the little things they might need to do beforehand just so that they feel comfortable about then taking that big next step. So that's a broad sweeping example, but you want to invite them to do that. And for the salesperson, this is really important because if they're not willing to take the small commitments, then you really need to question whether they're actually a qualified prospect or not, or a qualified buyer. Because if they're not willing to take the small ones, how could you possibly think they'll take the bigger ones?
Correct. Yeah. So I love that. So smaller effort, lower risk, and then incremental to
Lower risk.
form the bigger part. And quite often I'm thinking it's to do with information, isn't it? It's that they want information, we can share information, and we can make the way that we're moving stuff forward about the information and how they're finding it, we're sharing it, we're doing things, we're making it work. So that in itself is starting to build trust, isn't it? Because even just through the pure FaceTime and the fact we're sharing the experience and we're working together, that will have an effect, won't it, as to how we're going to build up that really key element to ultimately get us to that the end point, if you like. We do have to close the sale ultimately.
Yeah.
We're not against that, but it's just trying to dive straight in, isn't it?
Yeah, and you've defined it in an elegant way as well, which is the partnership model. Maybe you could talk more about that, because if they're not willing to partner with you and do their part, how could you possibly think that this person is engaged with you as well? But maybe you could talk more about that, because I remember in our previous podcast you mentioned something along those lines.
Sure. I mean, when you look at the elements of PQ or partnering skills, partnering intelligence, that I recommend every salesperson tries to understand and bring into how they operate. You don't have to be a full-on alliance. A couple of the elements there. One is about having mutual benefit. So yeah, if we're not aiming towards win-win, well, again, how can we expect there to be any commitment? Or when that becomes apparent, then people won't make that next step. Why? Because there's nothing in it for me. We also about interdependence, that we do, our successes are dependent on each other. So again, if we're exploring that and we're moving forward and we're showing that, working it out together, that is going to ultimately takes that point where we are going to do business together. And the fabled close where, we've shaken hands and the deal is now struck. And actually, I would say it's only the beginning anyway, which is why I've got a constant problem with that word. You don't close the door, you open more doors, because you've got to now deliver. That's for me how partnering skills really helps the mindset. because I think there's a lot of stuff out there at the moment where we're not helping salespeople's mindset when it comes to closing. In fact, quite a lot of selling, but certainly the closing, and when we get this fascination and kind of go all, like, I was joking, but I'm dead serious about this, all 80s on us. It's not helpful.
No, it's not, and that's why I use the term inviting, right? Because a lot of people will know this, but not stakeholder commitment, but having someone come with you along the journey and almost be part of formulating how that journey evolves and agreeing to it, you've got that person's commitment far stronger than if you are dictating. So one of the best ways to break trust when gaining commitment is, surprise, surprise, it's all about you, right? This is a recurring theme throughout this series that we've been talking about, but it's a really, really important one. If you
Taking
are
us 8 minutes this
dictating, so
time.
we talk about, yeah, exactly. It's like, I mean, if you are trying to control the whole process, well, let's see if we beat the record. So if you control the process and almost kind of ask the person and say, is that okay with you? Yeah, you might get a social profile person or a type of person that will just agree, but that's not commitment, right? They're just agreeing just to go along with it, but they have no intention of doing the action and following you. But if you invite the person to be part of formulating how we move forward, without, I'm not saying lose control, because there is an element of importance around, as a salesperson, you need to kind of have some form of control of the direction, of course, but there's a balance, right? Which is what you term as partnership. But get them involved in the process. That's how you gain someone's commitment, not force feeding it down them into submission and expecting them to then acquiesce to your desires, and then that's it. It's a partnership, as you describe it.
Yeah, so it's not an arm wrestle. No, and we're working on things together. As I say, the salesperson is steering it, is controlling it from the point of view that we're making sure we are making progress. You're not trying to twist,
Yeah.
manipulate, and the rest of it. And for me, the most elegant way I've heard of doing this, when we get to the point of whatever step we need to make next, is what James Muir talks about in his book, The Perfect Close, because he studied the language patterns, he studied a lot of the information, and it brings some of the psychology into it. And then I'm sure he won't mind me sharing it, because he's very generous on sharing info.
Not at all.
The language
Yeah.
pattern of, does it make sense for us too? Now we've worked out what it is that we're going to do. So does it make sense for us to do this then? Yes, no. Yes. Okay, good. Right. Excellent. That's, I think, how you do invite somebody, as you say. No, I'm not ready for that invitation yet. Okay. Well, what do you think makes sense? So we're still working on it together. So then you can get their input on it. It's genius language pattern. When I came across it, it's like, that's so cool.
It is.
Because it completely
and
ticks the
let's
boxes.
break that down as well. Yeah, and by the way, that last part's really great, because someone says, well, no, that doesn't make sense, and then you ask them, well, what does make sense? And oftentimes it's because some form of action has to be conducted by the buyer for it to then be able to make sense for them, or there's some sort of information or something that you as a seller haven't done or is missing that the buyer needs to see as well, right? In which case, you're now on a path to having that other form of commitment we talked about, which is some form of homework, some form of next steps. So it's a great way. That's a great example of how to gain someone's commitment and advance the sales process in an elegant way.
And it comes with that ethos, that mindset. We want to work together. We want to move it forward. We want to do the right thing, right time. And I do get worried if people have learnt closers, and it's still out there. People are like, oh, use the Ben Franklin, use the whatever, and people are just going to go, no, and you will bust all credibility. So yeah, I think for me that's sort of the thing. We got to get up to date. Got to be a bit more, I can't want to say grown up about it, or a bit more modern at least. And that is what's going to help us to not build trust, maintain trust, and keep the sale alive. Brilliant.
Yeah, absolutely. And the buyers know that there is a quote unquote close, right? Whatever the terminology is. they know that this is going to, the intention is for them to spend money and, you know, for you to have a deal, right? We don't want, anyway, that's just in the nomenclature, but they know what the path and the direction is, right? But we need to do it in a bit more of an elegant way. And they are certainly not going to enjoy, you know, sledgehammer approach at the end, which is buy now. And they're certainly not going to appreciate some of the levers that we currently do in sales, which we haven't talked about yet, right? Which is important, which is things like discounting, things like, fear of missing out, putting a deadline, etc., all of which are so blatantly sales related, right? And are blatantly in the seller's interest that the buyer couldn't care less. I had a buyer once in my early days in sales when we were encouraged to do discounting. And I was listening in on this call. It wasn't my call, but I have experienced something similar. And someone tried to do the discount and they said, it's going to, this is going to run out by the end of this month. And the buyer said, well, I'll wait until the next month. And the seller was flustered and said, well, no, we were not going to have this offer then, because I'm sure you will.
Yeah. At the end of every month, funny enough, because that's what happens, because you'll get desperate for your results. You've trained us to behave like that as buyers.
Yeah. Crazy to think that the buyer doesn't realize that. The average buyer has, I think, something like 5 to 10 more years. I can't remember the exact number, but it's in that range of 5 to 10 more years experience buying, not in their profession, buying, than the average seller has experience selling. We forget that buyers go through buying courses because there's a huge amount of responsibility. So they know all the tricks of the trade. They know the game better than you do. So, quit trying to trick them. Stop trying to trick them and try to do business with them.
I think we end on that. Quickly, stop trying to trick them and start doing business with them. Best advice you can give about closing.